All right, we're going to start our very first panel today, and this will be to unpack the rise of China as a geopolitical power and its vast implications for the United States and the international system today. So please join me in welcoming Matt Pottinger, former Deputy National Security Advisor, Glenn Tiffert, Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Lingling Wei, Chief China Correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, and our moderator, Ruth Todd, Senior VP and Chief Reputation Officer at Nu Skin. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Thank you. 1, 2, 3, test. Can you hear me?
We'll talk loud.
I think we can hear you. Can you speak?
Okay. Testing.
No. Okay.
Hello.
You're live. Yeah. Okay. Lingling, you answer all the questions.
Let's just double check. Can we hear you? Matt?
Let's see.
Oh, wait.
Can you hear me okay?
There we go.
Is
Is
it on?
that better?
Great.
Thank you.
And me?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yay for our IT tech people. Well, you heard from their short introductions. First of all, they could have lengthy introductions, every one of these panelists. You heard, though, from their short introductions, we have an illustrious group here that we have much to learn from, and we're so grateful for you to come, and thanks for being here today. We really, really appreciate having you, and it's been good. It's been so wonderful to get to know Matt and Glenn and Lingling. Yesterday, a little bit, I got to be with them, and it was just absolutely terrific. So you are in for a great next little while here. We want to learn about China. We want to talk about China-U.S. relations. Let's start with a little context for today, because anybody in this room that has watched China, and many of them do business with China, they have seen a lot of change in the last 10 to 15 years. In fact, it's changed quite a bit. And we would look to the leadership of President Xi Jinping. So let's talk about him. What's happened over in China? Set the stage, and who is he? What's his agenda? We'll start with you, Matt.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, first of all, and World Trade Center, Utah University of Utah Valley University. It's nice to see you, Madam President. And you know, Xi Jinping is a very interesting leader because he is different and distinct in many ways from his immediate 2 or 3 predecessors. He has elevated himself, and the party that he leads has elevated him to a paramount leader status that's really more akin to Mao Zedong, or in the Soviet model, Joseph Stalin. And that's, don't take my word for it, that is really the way that the party is now describing him. They've elevated his writings to a state ideology called Xi Jinping thought. And so this isn't your typical, Chinese leader that we sort of grew up with in the last few decades. This is a leader who believes deeply in the ideology that he was brought up in, and that comes through in his own speeches, many of which are kept secret for many years, but which eventually dribble out in, for us, relatively obscure Chinese language publications. But in them, he describes a grand ambition, which is to achieve a global collective, as he calls it, which is based on his readings of Karl Marx and Engels and Lenin and Stalin. He talks about those leaders quite frequently, even though very little of that is ever translated into English, deliberately so, by the Chinese Communist Party. But he's a leader with grand ambitions that are not just domestic, they're not just regional, they're very much global in scope.
Mm-hmm. Add to that.
Yeah, what was most surprising about Xi Jinping is he belongs to a generation that experienced some of the worst abuses of the Communist parties and Mao's rule. And so there was the expectation that when he came to power, he would represent a more liberalizing trend. He came of age as an adult in a China that was opening, that was reforming, the Deng Xiaoping era. And he experienced as a teenager some of the worst abuses of the Cultural Revolution. And then it turns out that he drew exactly the opposite lessons, it seems, than what people were expecting. Instead, he doubled down on the discipline of the party. He drew lessons, and it seems to be his guiding light, that He did not want China and the Chinese Communist Party to follow the route that the Soviet Communist Party did. And so he was all about reinvigorating the party, tightening discipline to ensure that the party's primacy and control of China would not slip. And so step by step, he's been building very methodically his power and reinstitutionalizing the control apparatus of the party to ensure that it does not follow that route. And so I think if you look across sectors, whether it's politics, economics, control is the dominant word here.
Mm-hmm. All right, Lingling, you grew up there. You were in college. You were telling me you were in college when things seemed a lot more open. But how would you answer this question? You come from such a different perspective, and it's a needed perspective. We need to hear from you as well.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for the invite here to the World Trade Center, Utah, and the University of Utah. And it's an honor to be here with Matt and Glenn. Really appreciate it, Ruth. It's hard to follow based on what Matt and Glenn just laid out. I completely agree. A lot of his leadership is about strengthening party's control. I just wanted to go back a little bit. So in 2012, when Xi Jinping was chosen to be China's leader, a lot of people in China actually were craving a strong leader and someone who has a firm hand on the tiller. Because the previous 10 years under his predecessor, Hu Jintao, the collective power sharing approach had led to policy adrift, stalled reforms, corruption. And those 10 years, some call those 10 years lost decade in China. So in Xi Jinping, they got what they wanted, and then some, which is a very strong leader. He spent the past 10 years basically making himself this chairman of everything, right? He has taken personal charge of all the main levers of power, foreign policy, domestic politics, ideology, military, and even the economy. So, so after having accumulated all that power, he thinks that's basically necessary to try to realize his vision for China. His vision for China, I would say, I totally agree with Matt and Glenn, very clear. He wants to make China a rich and powerful country that is capable of competing with the U.S. economically, militarily, geopolitically. However, I would add one thing. The specific action plans he has undertaken to try to realize his vision haven't been that consistent. He started out actually trying to undertake some bold economic reforms, right? We all remember he talked about giving market forces a decisive role in the economy, which he saw as the natural continuation of Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening policy. He, directed his underlings to develop China's stock markets. Remember back in 2015, early 2015, there was this epic stock rally in China, which the Chinese called that Uncle Xi stock bull market. And of course, it turned into a huge epic bust. And that experience, and also later that year, China's little experiment with making the renminbi, the Chinese currency, a little bit more like normal currency, also backfired. So that experience really scarred him. He completely turned like 180 degrees. So that's one example of the inconsistency in his policies. And also foreign policy, I would say, he started out believing that a close relationship with the U.S., at least a stable relationship with the U.S., could benefit China, while also recognizing the U.S. as a very big potential threat to China. He believed both things. That's why earlier in his term, I think he first said about this to President Obama. He said that there are 1,000 reasons to get the U.S.-China relationship right, not one single reason to spoil it. Right? That was really the guiding principle for quite a number of years until the trade war. They nowadays in China's policy circles, especially foreign policy arena, you don't hear that principle anymore. You hear more about how the U.S. has become such a big national security threat to China. And along the way, as the U.S. China relationship has sunk as low as it has, China's relationship with Russia has reached a historical high. So that's just basically one thing I want to point out, the inconsistencies in his policy, despite he has a clear vision for China. As he seeks another 5-year term or many more years to come, the big question, we have very little evidence to show or to say that he will have any trouble getting this third term. But I do think a big question is, will he stay as chairman of everything for many years to come? Will, and can and should the U.S. do anything to try maybe help encourage the more moderate voices in China and pull some of the hardline policies back a little bit? So that's just my remarks.
And do you see that, could that possibly happen from your perspective? Could there be more moderate voices that, because she said he wanted to rule with a strong hand, the people wanted that.
I agree with Lingling, he's the chairman of everything. And when you reach that kind of paramount status in a single party Leninist system like China has, you don't give up power. You don't give up power when you've retained that status. The only way I think probably Xi Jinping will leave power will be in a coffin. I don't think that he's going to voluntarily give up even portions of his power. And I would love to see more moderate people, their voices again rise in the Chinese system. I think that those people are terrified. Many of them have either left or they are quiet right now in that system. I see no signs of, even though undoubtedly there's an enormous amount of unease with how badly the Chinese economy is doing, a lot of disappointment or anger at things that Xi Jinping's doing. I see no evidence of anyone of stature in that system directly criticizing or disagreeing with Xi Jinping.
Glenn, I see you nodding, and I'd like to just build on what Lingling said and ask you both. She talked about all of these things that Xi Jinping is doing domestically. What are you seeing, and what is he doing outside of the region and internationally that is trying to achieve that grand vision that you talked about?
Right, so we've spoken a lot about the Belt and Road, and many of you have probably heard a lot of the Belt and Road, right? The Belt and Road, I think, is deeply misunderstood, but has been a really important component of China's going out strategy for the last, decade or more. And the Belt and Road is, in some sense, if you think about it from the Chinese perspective, it's solving several problems that China has. Number one, we all know that China has a profound trade surplus with the United States, right? The trade deal that the last administration tried to negotiate with China was in part to address that. So China has tremendous US dollar foreign currency reserves. Currently, US T-bills, because interest rates for many years were very low, there's no return on that. So China had tremendous foreign currency reserves that it was trying to deploy in a more productive investment scheme. The Belt and Road was partly an attempt to recycle that money, to lend it on projects around the world that might generate higher returns. Secondly, China had tremendous overcapacity from its industrial infrastructure boom that it did domestically. You can only build so many ports and airports and roads and high-speed rails, and until you have to start laying people off if you can't find other ways to deploy them. And so Belt and Road was partly a response to that overcapacity. And then China just had a thirst for raw materials for further economic growth too. So those three components came together in a way that also coincided with China's sense that it was ready to begin competing with the U.S. around the world in regions that, frankly, the U.S. had neglected for much too long. And so going out into the world and telling the rest of the world that China had an alternative to offer, a different model of development for countries that had tried Western-led models of development and engagement with World Bank experts. And so they offered something that was very appealing in principle. And I think China's gotten a lot of mileage. They've shown up writing checks and offering loans to a lot of countries, and it gives them a sugar high. And the next administration or the next president of that country can worry about the hangover, but for the moment, it plays very well. So China's been very smart in that regard. And so the U.S. kind of needs to re-engage with the rest of the world that sees what China has achieved in the last 30 or 40 years as possibly something really attractive that they could learn from, because they've tried our recipes and it hasn't worked for a lot of them. It I think, challenges us to re-engage in a way that's more creative, that's more nimble.
Mm-hmm. So would you say in aggregate, even though there have been bumps along the road, pun intended, would you call it a success? Because there have been some barriers and things that have come up. What do you think about Belt and Road 10 years on?
Yeah, the best public opinion research around the world indicates that a lot of publics, particularly in Africa and Southeast Asia, look at China's economic miracle and they're like, wow, I want a piece of that, right? They don't necessarily see the negativity and all of the negative externalities attached to that. And I think it's really important to remind them that there are tremendous environmental costs, tremendous human rights costs, there are debt sustainability costs, but at the moment they're still experiencing the sugar rush of all that money, right? And so I think it has bought China a lot of mileage until COVID. I think China's management of COVID and the turn in wolf warrior diplomacy, China showing its fangs a little bit, has changed things. And so China's public opinion, the public opinion support for China in countries around the world, I think, is turning more negative. And they're finding it a challenge to manage that right now.
In just a few months, we are expecting to see the Chinese Communist Party have the 20th National Congress. Why is that significant for them to convene in that?
Well, this is going to be every 5 years the Communist Party convenes to select its leader for the next 5 years. And there was sort of an unofficial norm that was established in the Deng Xiaoping era that leaders would get a 10-year run. And Deng, being very shrewd, he picked his successor, and he also picked his successor's successor before he died. And each of those two successors were given a 10-year run. And then Xi Jinping emerged. And he has written into the Constitution that term limits apply to everyone except for him. So this is where he'll go beyond 10 years. And I suspect, it's hard to know, it's a black box, we don't really know, but I suspect he'll be in power for life.
Lingling, how would you answer that?
Oh, sure. So I wanted to add one point to what Glenn just said about Belt and Road. I totally agree. Belt and Road has bought China a lot of mileage, right? When the U.S. Had retreated a little bit from many areas of the world. But also, Belt and Road hasn't been that successful for China financially and economically. It's hugely expensive for them, right? You're seeing all those projects going to default, and the whole debt trap narrative really has given Beijing a bad name too. And frankly, this year, you haven't heard that much. And even last year, you didn't hear that much. Why? Because, China's own economy has been slowing dramatically. I really agree with one of the speakers who said about we shouldn't really underestimate China's strengths, especially for the foreseeable future. So they're having a lot of domestic problems to have to deal with. So I would just add one thing. I think it would be great to do analysis, on how Belt and Road really has affected the recipient countries, and also, how China is recalibrating this whole program. So the significance of the Chinese Party Congress, Matt just laid out perfectly. I would say, obviously the next leadership lineup, maybe I'm still optimistic, Matt. I still think there are moderate voices in China. And you perfectly laid out those speeches by Xi Jinping over the years. No doubt, not one single doubt, how, his attitude, the kind of hostility toward the West laid bare. But there, based on the conversations that I've had with people in China, there are still voices or care about China's relationship with the U.S. and the West overall. And there are still people who think Xi Jinping has made a huge mistake by aligning China so closely with Russia. To be frank, you see the whole no limits relationship actually is showing its limit in real time. So I think this is where I think China really differs from Russia. I think she still faces resistance within the party in terms of carrying out certain policies, despite, he went all ahead, putting out the broad outlines of what the policies should be like. So that's why I think maybe there's still hope, and for us, the U.S., to try to do a little bit more to encourage those moderate voices. And another thing, another importance about the Party Congress is that, in addition to lining up of the leadership, we should be on the lookout for what kind of statement, right, they put out. Some people are expecting probably more, even more hawkish words about, the struggle with capitalism, with the U.S.-led capitalism, if she, really gets more power. But, that kind of language might get pulled back, watered down a little bit if some other voices emerge. So that's another thing we should be really look out for, the kind of statement coming out of it.
So really time will tell. That story is yet to be written if any of those moderate voices. You have something, Glenn, go.
Yeah, if I could just add one point. I think it's really dangerous for us to personalize this too much, for our reading of China to rest purely on the shoulders of Xi Jinping. If Xi Jinping were to drop dead tomorrow, would China fundamentally change? I think that's a very important question to think about, right? And I actually think a lot less so than we might hope. Yes, there are more moderate voices, but I think there are powerful structural forces at play here that will constrain anyone who comes after him, and it might be next week or it might be 15 years from now. We don't know. Both of his parents led fairly long lives, so he could be around for quite a bit longer. And so the question is, let's not reduce China to this one man. There are much larger forces at play here that we need to analyze, and I'm less optimistic, I think, than Lingling about that.
Okay, so then let's take today. How would you characterize today the U.S.-China relations, and where do you think, the most salient points of alignment or misalignment?
Sure, yeah. So, the U.S. policy for decades, really since the end of the Cold War, was predicated on a big, bold, generous assumption, right? The assumption was the Soviet Union has just collapsed. The Eastern Bloc, all these Communist Party-led countries were turning either democratic or into some gray zone thing other than a single-party dictatorship. And so there was an assumption at the time, in our moment of triumph, because it was a triumph. We won the Cold War without firing a shot at our nuclear-armed adversary, which could have been catastrophic if it had come to that. But we had won, and our ideas had won, our system had won. And so there was an assumption that China inevitably would have to come in line with that historical trend, that it was going to have to liberalize first economically, and then hopefully the society and the politics would follow. And so we pursued a policy of enriching China with the belief that that would fundamentally change and really undermine the Chinese Communist Party. So in a way, we had a regime change policy for a quarter of the century until President Trump came into office. And President Biden has followed very closely in this area, not in many others, but in this area, the Trump and Biden China policies together constitute a paradigm shift away from this idea that the richer we make the Chinese Communist Party, the more likely it is to go extinct or to at least liberalize. So what we found was that it wasn't liberalizing. It did for a while. There was that great period in the 90s.
Very open with the West.
It was much more open. I was working for years in China at the Wall Street Journal, the same paper where Lingling is now, and it was a great time to be in China. It was optimistic. They were coming to the WTO, but then the reforms stalled out, and then under Xi Jinping they've gone into reverse. It is now about subordinating private enterprise well below the state. It's about the state reinserting itself to make major decisions about where capital should be allocated. China's not bad for at allocating capital for a government, but as a general rule, governments don't do as well as markets and free people at allocating capital, and that's proving to be true for China now as well. So that's why you had this paradigm shift where the United States said, look, we've been incredibly generous and open. We've trained generations of Chinese engineers and bureaucrats and business leaders, and we've transferred, not always willingly, massive amounts of technology to the Chinese economy. And then you hear speeches from the Chinese leader saying things like, we're going to wipe out capitalism from the earth. We're going to impose a Marxist vision. We're finally going to achieve Marx's dream of communism, and it's all going to be led by the Chinese Communist Party. And so at some point you have to say, geez, maybe this didn't work out the way that we'd planned, and therefore we need to actually start imposing costs on those activities that the Communist Party undertakes that harm U.S. national interests, whether it's stealing intellectual property or exporting precursors for making fentanyl that is now addicted millions of Americans. There's a whole range of things where we need to push back. I actually view it as a reactionary policy. I wrote the policy for the Trump administration with my colleagues, and President Biden's following a similar one. We were not the protagonist in this relationship. China was driving the direction of the relationship until we said we need to put the brakes on this a little bit. Now, I'm always careful to distinguish between the Chinese Communist Party and China writ large, because China is a great, incredible country filled with talented people that I want us to be continue to be deeply engaged with. But the party's goals are something else entirely, and we've got to. It was long overdue for us to change that.
Which causes the disconnect, the geopolitical misalignment. You had something to add. You were nodding.
Right. On top of what Matt said, I think there's a fundamental tension here because China does not accept the 70 years of U.S. primacy in the Western Pacific that arose at the end of World War II. Right? China regards itself as the rightful heir and hegemon in the region, as it was historically for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so from a Chinese perspective, it makes tremendous sense. They are now strong enough to begin asserting themselves against what had been the status quo. And that status quo inevitably comes at the expense of the U.S. Either that or sparks will fly where the two countries meet in the region, like the South China Sea. We've just seen this week the governments of Australia and Canada, for example, publicized intercepts of their flights over international waters where they allege that China behaved extremely irresponsibly and could have brought down their jets. Because China is now trying to make clear to U.S. allies and partners in the region that it does not accept their freedom to operate in that space, and it wants to control the domains around it. Now, you might say that's fine, that makes a great deal of sense, except the United States has treaty commitments in that region to countries like Japan and the Philippines, and it has very close relationship with Australia. And so I think it's a very dangerous and fraught situation, and particularly we could talk about Taiwan, where that might become a flashpoint. And so it needs to be managed extremely carefully, but a China that sees itself as the rightful hegemon, I think it's a dangerous situation because the U.S., if it retreats from the region, abandons its treaty allies and partners. And that's untenable for the United States, for our position in the world, the way we think of ourselves, and I think for our foreign policy. So it creates really, there's a crisis that's on a slow boil right now, I think.
You mentioned Taiwan. Let's just double click down on that for just a second. I know we don't have too much time, but how does that factor into this equation? Because it's a big issue.
Right.
I'm sure Taiwan is more of a specialty for both Matt and Glenn.
Just take a quick second and then we'll share.
Sure. I think this, Taiwan issue obviously is quickly becoming one of the biggest flashpoints, right, in the relationship between China and the U.S. And especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a lot of people, have been speculating when is China going to make the move for Taiwan. But I really, I'm not an expert on this, but I do think, this Russia's invasion of Ukraine has really been a wake-up call for the Chinese leaders in that the kind of unity, Western unity that was presented after the invasion took place, just it was quite a surprise for the Chinese. And the other thing was, the U.S. companies, right? They pulled out Russia, almost as soon as the invasion took place. And that really was a surprise to a lot of senior officials in Beijing as well, because they thought capitalists, they're only interested in profits, right? They have no values, but actually they demonstrate they have values, right? So I would just say that.
Yeah. You have something to add?
Yeah, those are all very good points that Lingling made, and it's Xi Jinping has changed his rhetoric about Taiwan as compared to his predecessors. So Deng Xiaoping famously said, if we have to wait 100 years or more to unify with Taiwan, then we'll do that. What you hear from Xi Jinping is a much more impatient set of policies, where he says, I'm not going to pass this on from generation to generation anymore. We're going to solve the Taiwan question, as he puts it. He said that his own grand vision, his own policy of achieving a Chinese dream of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation cannot be achieved unless Taiwan is unified. So this is a guy who, on his watch, wants to make it his legacy to unify Taiwan. The problem is there's no way to do that doesn't involve the use of force. And that's why I agree with Lingling. This is one of the most dangerous flashpoints in the world. And I think people, by and large, are underestimating the possibility of a war breaking out.
Mm-hmm. We don't have near enough time to dive into what I'd like to, but in our last few minutes, I would like to just ask you, what do we as a collective, this is a group of American business people, what do we need to know going forward? What do we need to educate ourselves on better? Sure. And I'd love to hear from all of you on that. Glenn, we'll start with you right in the middle, and then we'll go to
Happy to do that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's really important for us to realize China's already the #2 economy in the world. It may very well turn into the #1 economy. It is by some measures of purchasing power parity. But China's not going away, so we do have to find a way to coexist with China. And there are areas where I think that's going to be extremely difficult, but then there are areas where we can continue to do business and trade and should and experience investment in both directions from countries. And maintaining those channels is critical. But I think that if you are engaging with China either in business or education or people-to-people or cultural exchanges, it's really important to get the best understanding you can of Chinese policy as the Chinese government describes it. And then to assess what your exposure to risk would be. If you're, the 14th Five-Year Plan, for example, that China recently published, the Chinese government, it identifies at least 25 critical technologies that China does not lead the world in, which the U.S. tends to lead on, which Xi Jinping has identified as areas where China wants to establish its supremacy. If your business is in one of those areas, you need to anticipate a much higher level of risk. And even though your engagement with China might be all smiles and trade and business, you're being invited there for a purpose. They want to learn everything you know in order to put you out of business and to take your market share away. And so it's really good to go with eyes open there. If you're not in one of those areas, if you're not in a high technology space or a high IP, critical space, then it's an entirely different ballgame and a different set of considerations. So the answer varies from person to person.
Excellent. Lingling.
Sure, I completely agree with what Glenn just said. I would just say that, for the past few decades, right, I think U.S. companies really have played a key role in, helping China's economy and also, the whole enhanced the openness of the Chinese public, the embracing of the Western world, Western civilization. I think, we really shouldn't dismiss that. And really, engagement has worked in a lot of ways, has won hearts and minds of a lot of Chinese people. That's why, the party to this day is still so worried about 和平演变, peaceful transformation or peaceful revolution, and still talks about we need to guard against, an attempt to try to do Western constitutionalism. Who was doing that, really? But so I really think China is still an amazing place to be in, and it's really sad in a way to see the relationship has sunk so low. One hand, the U.S. really many years has helped China, achieves an economic miracle. On the other hand, China itself has helped lift 800 million people out of poverty. What accomplishment. What a great friendship that should have been. But now couldn't be more adversarial. So I think businesses can still play a role here to, the bridge between the two governments, between the two people. And of course, the risks of much higher risk Glenn laid out, not just in China, I think in the US as well. So you're basically straddling both countries and trying to navigate both landscapes. So it's a hard job, but it's worth it for the greater good of mankind.
I've read a few books that were just published in the last handful of months that I would all of them I would recommend. One is by Professor Aaron Friedberg at Princeton. It's called Getting China Wrong, but it's a very concise history of our policy and the misassumptions that we made, and it also lays out sort of a pathway for a sane strategy designed to allow us to compete effectively. Rush Doshi wrote a book called The Long Game. Rush is a scholar who's now working on President Biden's National Security Council staff as one of his China directors. And that one looks at primary source materials going back to the end of the Cold War that show that senior leaders in the Communist Party secretly decided to regard the United States as the primary adversary, although they kept that fairly well guarded. But it's nonetheless quite explicit that the U.S. would, from 1991 on out, be the number one adversary of the Chinese Communist Party. And now, of course, that fact is out in the open. Xi Jinping doesn't, the fig leaf has blown away, and we can see what that strategy is when we pay close enough attention. The third is one that was just published this week by Ian Easton, and that book is called The Final Struggle. And Ian Easton is another one of these scholars who reads primary source materials in Chinese language, some of them ones that are not meant to be seen by foreigners, but which are nonetheless authoritative documents that distill Xi Jinping thought, that talk about China's foreign policy. And in that one, he has a few chapters that look at that ideology and what China's goals are in its own words, in the Chinese Communist Party's own words. So those are three good ones.
That sounds great. In your mind then, ideologically, we're never going to be exactly aligned. We never have been, we never will be. Are we destined for conflict between the United States and China, or can we find a way?
No, we're not destined for conflict. We should actually, even though there are some points that are very much different from the Cold War that we experienced with the Soviet Union, there are also similarities. And we should learn from those similarities because we won that war without having to confront and go to war with our top adversary. So I think we very much, if we learn from that, and if we remain unified at home, do less to harm ourselves, in a sense, I have very little doubt that we're actually going to win the competition, as I think we must.
All right, take 30 seconds and tell us the thought on your mind that you haven't been able to say in this panel. Lingling, we'll start with you, then Glenn, then Matt.
Gosh.
I know 30 seconds is hard, but
I know. There's so many thoughts that are going through my mind now. Well, I guess I just think, there's just China is so much more complex and nuanced, than meets the eye, and I think it's really important for all of us to keep an open mind, and as Matt pointed out, conflict is not, we're not really destined for conflicts, but I really think, we have to resume lines of communication with the Chinese. They're currently none, non-existent.
Build relationships, continue to build those relationships. Glenn.
That was exactly my point. She scooped me. She's a good reporter.
She does work for the Wall Street Journal. She's a good scooper. Yeah.
But I think that really is the danger here. We should maintain those channels of communication, not because we're trying to change China necessarily, but so that we can better understand it and anticipate where risk is and work through problems with China. because that's key so that we don't have unanticipated and unwelcome outcomes. And those channels have dried up at almost every level, from top-level government all the way down to universities and cultural organizations. Some of it is COVID, but some of it predates that, and a lot of it actually was, as I think Matt said, the U.S. was not the protagonist here. There has been a real inward turn in China. And so trying to kind of coax them out of that in a way and reestablish those linkages is key here, because otherwise miscommunication and miscalculation result, and we do not want that.
Absolutely. Matt?
Yeah, all great points. And I think that when you have a dictator, as Xi Jinping is in power for as long as he's been in power, and he's about to extend that timeline, the quality of information that reaches the top gets worse and worse with time. And we've seen this throughout history. And I think it's happening now. It was one of my observations when I was in government, was that messages that we were trying to get to the top were not reaching the top because people were frightened to deliver news that did not comport with Xi's predilections. And so I think that is bound to get worse, that dynamic. And it's already having repercussions for China and for its economy. China's filled with talented people and rightfully ought to be, given the fact that it's the largest country in the world, a engine of innovation. That is drying up right now. A lot of entrepreneurs are leaving China because they don't believe that their companies, once they reach a certain size, are welcome anymore, or that they have to be commandeered systematically by the party. And we've seen that with their technology firms. We've seen the shutting down of some major sectors of the economy that used to drive growth. So I think that the mistakes that Xi Jinping is already making and will continue to make are going to get worse.
Okay, you already gave us 3 books. I'm going to have you think about a podcast or something else. Will you give us each a book and or a podcast that you would recommend to this audience? Because we want to keep learning about China. We want to be informed as we go forward as a citizenry.
I'll start. I'll add one more book because I gave you current event books. Lingling had a recent book.
I told her she could make a shameless plug for her book because she did write a great book. But go ahead.
But I was talking about current events and our policy and our a really good read that introduces you to the whole story and arc of U.S. China relations is John Pomfret's history that came out maybe 5 or 6 years ago, called The Beautiful Country in the Middle Kingdom. So it's U.S. China relations from 1776 up until just a few years ago. But that's a wonderful, rich read filled with great stories.
Great recommendation.
That's an amazing choice, by the way. You all need to read that book. So I'm going to flip and do something, recommend 2 books. I'd be remiss if I didn't recommend my colleague Elizabeth Economy's latest book, The World According to Xi, which I think is really useful for people who want to understand contemporary China in the latest sense. But then for those of you who have a more wonky disposition, and I think that it maybe answers a question that Lingling raised, there's a new book by a group out of the College of William and Mary called Banking on Beijing, which does really sort of gold standard empirical work on the Belt and Road and how effective it's been and its repercussions. And it, in the best empirical sense, it reaches some interesting and challenging conclusions that you might not have expected. So I'll just say that and leave the suspense.
Great. Lingling.
Okay, I agree with all the great book recommendations, and because I have Ruth's permission, so I'm just going to give a shameless plug for this book. I co-wrote with my colleague in Washington, Bob Davis. It's called Superpower Showdown. It's basically a journalistic, view and about the evolution of the U.S. China relationship. All the way going back to the Clinton years. And I also would highly recommend Wild Swans, if you like, that kind of memoir type of work. It's just such, I've read it like 10 times. It's just such a, great story about a family that, a Chinese family basically the story of the family in the broader context of the changes in China. The podcast I would highly recommend, History That Doesn't Suck.
Right here at UVU, right?
Yeah, and then we're going to have an episode this afternoon about U.S. China relations.
Perfect. Thank you, Lingling, Glenn, Matt. How about a round of applause? Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Wonderful. Thank you very much. I think we're good. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.